Hey guys, tonight we slip into velvet-draped halls where shadows stretch long, and every candle flame looks like it's hiding a secret. You step into the chambers of medieval kings, not as a guest, not even as a servant, but as a quiet presence drifting through centuries. You're about to see what few scribes dared record, the way desire, lust, and scandal seeped into royal courts and corroded crowns. Kings who ruled lands by day often ruled their beds by night, and sometimes those private passions broke entire kingdoms apart. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting the chivalric fairy tale version of history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, go ahead and type your location and local time down below, because nothing says bedtime history quite like a bunch of strangers confessing they're listening to royal gossip at 2 in the morning. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the entrance of a medieval palace, the stone walls rising like cliffs, banners snapping in the wind, yet your focus is pulled inward, toward corridors lined with velvet curtains and secret staircases. This isn't the kind of history where knights gallop gallantly or monks chant in tidy cloisters. This is the quiet, slippery undercurrent of power, the bedchambers where a king's whims could dictate politics, the whispered trysts that could shift alliances more than treaties ever could. The first thing you notice is how much effort goes into hiding it all. Doors don't quite line up with the walls, because there are hidden passages for mistresses to slip in unseen. Courtyards seem overly manicured, because they're stages where queens must perform composure while rumors swirl around them. Even the tapestries are more than decoration. They muffle sound, they shield secrets. It's as though the very architecture of medieval monarchy was designed to keep lust in and scandal out. Of course, lust never really stays hidden. You watch as servants exchange looks when a king lingers too long in the company of a certain courtier. You hear gossip ripple like wind through rushes. Have you seen the jewels he gave her? Why does he always keep him so close? And you realize something vital. In these palaces, a monarch's personal indulgence was never just personal. Every gesture carried political weight. Every favorite, whether mistress or companion, was a potential rival in the great game of influence. Take, for instance, the common medieval notion that kings were chosen by God. Nice theory, but in practice, God's so-called representative often found himself spending more time at banquets than at prayer, more time with lovers than with advisors. Historians still argue whether this disconnect made people cynical about divine kingship, or whether subjects simply shrugged and said, "Well, he's still our king, let him have his fun." Either way, the tension was there. The crown demanded reverence, yet the man beneath it was vulnerable to desire. And what desires they were. You step closer into the candlelight of a great hall and watch a feast unfold. Platters of roasted meats, goblets spilling over with wine, and somewhere between the music and the dice games, eyes meet across the table. A queen notices her husband staring too intently at a young noblewoman. A bishop scowls, already composing a sermon in his head. A jester cracks a joke about Cupid's arrows, and the room laughs just enough to hide the truth. Everyone knows lust is in the air. The quirky part is how these indulgences weren't just tolerated, they were almost expected. Chronicles mention kings with dozens of illegitimate children, each one casually provided with a small estate or a church post. Entire bloodlines trace back to these shadowy affairs. Imagine being a monk in the 13th century and realizing your abbot's nephew is actually the king's unacknowledged son. Awkward family reunion, anyone. But here, where it gets even slipperier, lust wasn't always about women. You hear whispers about close male companions, friendships that raised eyebrows, relationships that later chroniclers either demonized or conveniently erased. Desire didn't fit into tidy categories, even if the church tried to. The kings themselves often didn't care. What mattered was the intensity of the bond and how it tilted the balance of court politics. One mainstream historical fact to ground you. Edward II of England, yes, we'll get to his mess in the next section, showered his favorite, Piers Gaveston, with titles, jewels, and lands, while ignoring barons who actually ran the kingdom. That favoritism wasn't just emotional, it reshaped England's power structure. The quirky tidbit: chroniclers describe Gaveston parading around in silk and jewels so flashy that nobles called him the king's idol. Historians still argue whether their relationship was purely political, deeply romantic, or something more physical. But whatever it was, it drove England to rebellion. See how this works. A king's lust, whispered about in corners, could turn into open revolt. You don't get a sharper reminder that private and public were never separate in medieval thrones. Now picture yourself drifting into the royal chapel, the one place you'd expect a little restraint. Candles flicker, incense curls into the rafters, and yet even here, lust leaves its fingerprints. Donations to churches, massive golden chalices, entire monasteries, sometimes sprang from guilty kings trying to bribe God into ignoring last night's sins. Confessors became not just spiritual guides but also keepers of royal secrets, carrying knowledge of every affair, every broken vow, every oops, I shouldn't have done that. Imagine the leverage that gave them. Still, not all was guilt. Sometimes kings flaunted their excesses. A banquet might feature not just feasting but open flirtation, a kind of performance where power and lust danced together. Courtiers knew how to play the game. A smile here, a lowered gaze there, the kind of staged modesty that made the king think he was the hunter, not the prey. You watch it unfold like a slow chess match, except instead of pawns and knights, the pieces are gowns, perfumes, and glances across candlelit tables. Of course, the ordinary people weren't blind to all this. Ballads, satirical poems, and tavern gossip turned kings' desires into punchlines. There's a surviving medieval French verse mocking a ruler's clumsy attempts at romance, comparing him to a rooster that can't crow. Crude humor, sure, but it shows you something. The idea of the lustful king was common currency. People may not have had the internet, but they definitely had memes, in the form of mocking songs carried from town to town. You pause for a moment, taking in how strange this is. Power so absolute, yet so fragile. A king could command armies, but not always his own urges. And those urges, once revealed, gave enemies a weapon sharper than any sword. So as you settle deeper into this palace of whispers, you sense the stage being set. You've seen the velvet curtains, the candlelit games, the way lust hides and flaunts itself all at once. You've seen how architecture, rumor, and ritual all conspired to both protect and expose desire. And now, the stories of individual kings are waiting for you, each one a cautionary tale, a scandalous adventure, a historical riddle of what happens when royal lust outruns royal duty. You're ready to move closer, step by step, into the lives of those rulers who let desire guide their crowns, sometimes to glory, often to ruin. You drift deeper into the echoing halls of English history, and the figure who steps into view is King Edward II. He's not the heroic monarch his father, Edward I, nicknamed the Hammer of the Scots, had been. No, this Edward seems softer, distracted, drawn to pleasures of the heart in ways his advisors found both baffling and infuriating. You watch him as he sits on a carved oak throne, but his eyes aren't fixed on the crown jewels or the treaties on the table. Instead, they keep flicking toward one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston arrives like a spark in dry straw. Tall, confident, with a taste for luxurious fabrics and an even sharper taste for showing them off. He doesn't act like the humble noble he technically is. He walks as though the entire realm is his stage, and Edward is his devoted audience. You notice how Edward's posture shifts when Gaveston enters, a subtle leaning forward, a smile that lingers too long. Court chroniclers later described Gaveston as magnetic, flamboyant, and dangerously arrogant. You don't need the chronicles. You can see it for yourself as the two laugh together, shutting out the grumbling barons at the far end of the hall. The king's affection for Gaveston wasn't just whispered in corners. It blazed openly, like a torch everyone could see. Titles, lands, and jewels were showered upon him, so many that the nobility, who had fought in wars and spilled blood to earn their estates, began to boil with rage. Imagine being a powerful earl and watching this relative nobody flaunt rubies at court, rubies that technically your taxes helped buy. It didn't go down well. Historians still argue whether Edward and Gaveston were lovers in the physical sense. Some insist it was political favoritism exaggerated into scandal by enemies. Others lean toward the more intimate interpretation, pointing to chronicles filled with language hinting at unusual closeness. But as you stand here in the candlelight, listening to the laughter that echoes just a little too warmly between them, you feel how raw and personal their bond must have been. Now here's a quirky little detail. Gaveston was infamous for mocking the other nobles with cruel nicknames. He'd call one baron the Piglet and another the Actor, ridiculing them in front of the king. Think of it as medieval trolling, except instead of mean tweets, you've got snide remarks whispered with a smirk across a banqueting table. Edward found it hilarious, but the barons, not so much. Their resentment hardened into something lethal. You follow Edward and Gaveston into quieter rooms, where politics and pleasure intertwine. Edward, inexperienced in governance and far more interested in companionship, leaned on Gaveston for advice. It wasn't good advice. He ignored the demands of his lords, raised taxes without their consent, and generally behaved as though his personal circle mattered more than his entire kingdom. You can almost hear the scraping of swords being sharpened in frustration, the mutters of rebellion taking shape in darkened tents outside the city walls. The English barons eventually had enough. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston more than once. Picture the scene. The king sulking, heartbroken, packing like a lovesick youth while his lords delivered ultimatums. But Edward couldn't stay away. Each time he recalled Gaveston, sneaking him back like a forbidden lover in a romance novel. The pattern repeated until finally the nobles took matters into their own hands. In 1312, Gaveston was captured, dragged to Warwick Castle, and executed without the king's consent. You imagine Edward's grief when he received the news, his closest companion slain, his authority mocked by his own nobility. This wasn't just personal tragedy, it was political disaster. A king unable to protect his favorite looked weak, vulnerable, almost childlike. Edward never recovered fully from Gaveston's loss, but he didn't learn caution either. Instead, he transferred his obsessive affection to another man, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Ah, the Despensers. If Gaveston had been flashy and flamboyant, Hugh was ruthless and calculating. You watch him slink into Edward's orbit, less glittering, more venomous. Where Gaveston had mocked nobles, Despenser outright robbed them, seizing lands and titles, using the king's favor to enrich himself obscenely. Edward was besotted again, blind to the growing fury around him. The barons rose once more. England plunged into civil strife, a kingdom cracking under the weight of one king's unchecked affections. But this time, rebellion had another key figure, Queen Isabella. She wasn't just neglected, she was humiliated by Edward's blatant preference for Despenser. You can almost see her at court, stiff-backed, eyes narrowed, lips tight as her husband draped favors on another man. In a world where queens were expected to embody dignity and fertility, Isabella was treated like a prop. And here comes another curious tidbit. During his reign, Edward apparently enjoyed rowing boats and working with common craftsmen, a hobby so unusual that chroniclers mocked him as unkingly. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine humility or a strange detachment from his royal role. Either way, it added to the perception that Edward didn't quite know how to be a king in the traditional mold. Combine that with his obsession for his favorites, and you've got the recipe for a monarch doomed to be remembered less for statecraft, more for scandal. You trail Edward through these years of decline, hearing rebellion grow louder, feeling the pressure mounting. The Despensers become despised figures across the land. The Queen herself eventually allies with rebels, leading to Edward's capture and deposition. His end is one of the darkest whispered tales of English history. You've probably heard the rumor. that infamous story of his grotesque murder involving a red-hot poker. Modern historians mostly reject it as propaganda, a vicious attempt to paint his sexuality and his downfall as poetic punishment. But the fact that people believed it tells you something crucial. Edward's reputation for lust and favoritism was so strong, so notorious, that even the most shocking tale seemed plausible. As you drift back from this story, you realize Edward II embodies exactly how desire corroded the throne. His love for Gaveston may have been tender, his bond with Despenser perhaps toxic, but both consumed him so fully that the machinery of kingship broke down around him. England wasn't governed by wisdom or diplomacy during his reign. It was governed by the pull of his affections. And here's the strange irony. Edward II left behind a legacy less of laws or victories and more of questions. Was he a king who dared love openly in a time of rigid norms? Or was he simply a weak ruler undone by favoritism? Historians still argue whether he deserves pity as a misunderstood monarch or condemnation as a disastrous one. For now, you leave him in his candle-lit chamber, eyes always turning toward the seat beside him, waiting for a companion who will never return. The velvet curtains sway slightly, as though stirred by the sigh of a man who lost both his kingdom and his heart to desire. You leave the damp English halls of Edward II behind and drift across the Channel, into the glittering but troubled court of France. The year is the early 1300s, and King Philip IV, called Philip the Fair for his striking blonde looks and tall, statuesque bearing, sits at the heart of power. On the surface, everything about him gleams with control. His court dazzles, his treasury bulges from clever taxation, and his enemies whisper that he is cold as marble, ruthless as iron. But as you linger near the stone towers of Paris, you hear a scandal beginning to stir, one so shocking it will stain his family for generations. The story begins not with Philip himself, but with his 3 sons and their young wives. The royal princesses-in-law were elegant, educated, and supposed to embody the chaste perfection of queens-to-be. Yet behind the embroidered veils and jewel-crusted girdles, temptation stirred. You follow them through the echoing chambers of the Château de Nesle in Paris, a riverside fortress that would soon lend its name to one of the great sex scandals of medieval Europe, the Tour de Nesle affair. It starts with suspicion. Queen Isabella of England, daughter of Philip the Fair, and yes, the very same Isabella who would later rebel against Edward II, came home to visit her father. At some gathering, she noticed her sisters-in-law exchanging embroidered purses with 2 handsome Norman knights, the D'Aulnay brothers. Gifts, in medieval etiquette, were not casual trinkets. A purse wasn't just a pretty object. It was a deeply personal token, stitched by hand, carrying symbolism of loyalty and intimacy. Isabella's sharp eyes caught the detail, and her sharper mind leapt to the conclusion: adultery. She told her father. You can almost feel the ice settle over Philip's court as the king processes the accusation. Philip the Fair was not a man known for warmth. His enemies described him as a statue king, handsome but unfeeling. And yet this accusation, this whisper of dishonor in his bloodline, hit him with volcanic force. To medieval kings, lineage was everything. To suggest that the royal wombs had been tainted by other men's seed wasn't just gossip. It was a potential threat to dynastic survival. Who could trust the paternity of future kings? An investigation began, but quietly. Guards watched, spies listened, servants whispered. Eventually, the young princesses were accused: Margaret, Blanche, and Jean, wives of Philip's sons. Margaret and Blanche were said to have taken the D'Aulnay brothers as lovers, sneaking them into the Tour de Nesle by night. Jean III may have known about it, or perhaps joined in, but her role remains murky. Historians still argue whether all 3 were guilty, or whether jealousy and politics exaggerated the charges. When the scandal broke openly in 1314, Paris erupted in fascination. Imagine it. The most powerful royal family in Europe brought low by bedroom gossip. People crowded taverns to speculate, troubadours composed bawdy verses, and nobles gossiped behind fans of peacock feathers. The princesses were arrested and thrown into grim dungeons. The two brothers, tortured, flayed, and executed in grotesque public fashion, their bodies a warning to any knight who thought he could trespass into royal beds. The quirky tidbit here. Chroniclers note that the affair supposedly came to light because the knights grew careless, meeting the princesses in broad daylight disguised as merchants. Not exactly subtle. Some even claim the men were recognized because they were wearing fine boots too elegant for ordinary traders. Medieval scandal brought down by bad footwear choices. As for the women, their fates diverged. Margaret was confined in a cold, dank cell at Chateau-Gaillard, where she allegedly died. Some say of neglect. Others whisper she was quietly strangled to avoid further disgrace. Blanche, too, was imprisoned for years, her once bright future reduced to shadows. Jean, however, was acquitted, perhaps because her husband loved her fiercely or perhaps because her family wielded stronger political strings. The judgments, like the accusations, blurred between justice and convenience. Philip himself didn't live long after the scandal broke. Some claimed the shame of it weakened him, others blamed a hunting accident. He died later that same year, leaving behind sons whose reputations were forever scarred by their wives' alleged betrayals. In fact, the dynasty itself soon faltered. Philip's sons each reigned briefly, then died without strong heirs. Historians still debate whether the Tour de Nesle affair contributed directly to the collapse of the Capetian line, but symbolically, it poisoned the well. The kings of France looked less like gods chosen, more like cuckolds mocked by fate. You pause, listening to the echo of this scandal across centuries. It wasn't just family drama, it became a political weapon. Enemies of Philip's line spread the tale gleefully, using it as proof that God had withdrawn favor. Later chroniclers embroidered the story, making it more salacious with each retelling. Was it all true? Were the princesses really guilty, or were they victims of a vindictive daughter tattling to her cold father? Historians still argue, pointing to gaps in the records, contradictions in the confessions, many extracted under torture. What remains clear is that the scandal stuck, and no amount of royal dignity could erase it. Now step into the chamber where Margaret, once dressed in silk and pearls, sits in rags. The walls sweat with damp, rats scratch at the straw, and somewhere in the distance, a guard coughs. She was born to be a queen, yet here she shivers, accused of dishonoring the throne. Whether guilty or innocent, her story reminds you of something essential about medieval power. Lust, or even the rumor of it, could topple crowns just as effectively as swords. And Isabella, you can almost imagine her satisfaction. The princess who noticed the purses, the one married to England's Edward II, had already endured her own humiliations. Perhaps exposing her sisters-in-law was part piety, part jealousy, part political calculation. Centuries later, playwrights and novelists would dramatize her role as both detective and betrayer, turning the affair into a moral fable about vigilance. But the truth is hazier, as truth always is when filtered through scandal. The legacy of the Tour de Nesle affair lingered long after the dungeon doors closed. In French memory, it became a shorthand for royal corruption and female desire running rampant. It also seeded one of history's larger arcs, the so-called Curse of the Templars. Just a few years earlier, Philip the Fair had destroyed the Knights Templar, seizing their wealth and executing their leaders. Legend claims that as he died at the stake, Grand Master Jacques de Molay cursed Philip and his descendants. And sure enough, within years, Philip was dead, his sons disgraced, his dynasty collapsing. Was the Tour de Nesle affair part of that curse? Historians still argue, but storytellers certainly loved the symmetry. You step back from the towers of Paris, hearing the jeers of the crowd as the D'Aulnay brothers are dragged to their deaths, hearing the whispers of courtiers tallying which heirs still count as legitimate, and sensing the cold satisfaction of fate. The fair king, so proud of his beauty and authority, left behind not a shining dynasty but a mess of scandal, suspicion, and a weakened line. And as you float onward, you realize, lust didn't have to be proven true to corrode a throne. It could be proven to save a nation. The rumor alone was enough. You journey south, leaving behind the northern chill of Paris for the blazing heat of Castile. The air here tastes of dust, olives, and incense, and the very landscape feels torn between Christian kingdoms and Moorish frontiers. It is the early 14th century, and on the throne sits Alfonso, Exai of Castile, a king who, more than any of his peers, lived his life not merely as a ruler but as a man enthralled by passion, openly defying the boundaries of marriage, morality, and politics. Alfonso Exai's reign, 1312–1350, was marked by both military triumphs and personal scandal. Unlike Philip the Fair, who kept a marble mask of dignity even as scandal tore his dynasty apart, Alfonso seemed almost proud to flaunt his private choices in public. He was a king unashamed of his appetites, and it was those appetites, particularly his obsession with one woman, that would forever define his rule. The marriage that meant little. Like all royal men of his era, Alfonso's marriage was political. He wed Maria of Portugal, daughter of King Afonso IV of Portugal, in what was supposed to be a grand alliance between the two Iberian kingdoms. The match promised stability, heirs, and unity, but Alfonso's heart had no place for his queen. He found her dull, uninspiring, and perhaps worse, a pawn pushed upon him by diplomacy. In most medieval courts, this would have mattered little. Kings took mistresses constantly, and queens were expected to endure it quietly, as long as their position was respected in public. But Alfonso would not play by those rules. He did not merely take a mistress, he elevated her above Maria, humiliating his queen in ways that scandalized Europe. The mistress who became a queen in all but name. Her name was Leonor de Guzman, a widow of noble birth, intelligent, ambitious, and dangerously captivating. When Alfonso met her, he became consumed. Unlike many royal affairs, this was not a discreet liaison. Alfonso treated Leonor not as a secret indulgence but as a partner, parading her in court, showering her with lands, titles, and power. Maria of Portugal, the actual queen, was left to fade into the background. At public ceremonies, Leonor often appeared in places of honor. While Maria sat humiliated, Leonor was seen as the true consort of the king. To the Castilian court and foreign envoys, the message was unmistakable. The mistress ruled the heart of Alfonso, and thus Castile itself. In time, Leonor bore Alfonso 10 children, each legitimized and given status above what bastards normally could expect. Meanwhile, Maria gave him only one legitimate son, Peter of Castile, later remembered as Peter the Cruel. This imbalance of children not only deepened Maria's misery, but set the stage for one of the bloodiest civil wars Castile would ever endure. The shockwaves through Christendom. To flaunt a mistress was not unusual. To elevate her above the queen, however, was scandalous. Foreign courts gossiped. Portugal fumed. Maria's father, King Afonso IV, was outraged at his daughter's humiliation. The papacy scolded Alfonso, demanding he restore dignity to his lawful wife. Yet Alfonso ignored them all. His passion for Leonor was too strong, his stubbornness too great. Even within Castile, whispers turned to outrage. Nobles grumbled that Leonor's relatives were gaining too much influence. Her children, especially, became pawns in an escalating battle over succession. For Alfonso seemed intent on providing for them generously, at times more generously than for his legitimate heir, Peter. The scandal was not simply one of lust, but of governance. By centering his personal life so publicly around Leonor, Alfonso blurred the line between bedroom and throne room. Political decisions were suspected of being swayed by her charms. Court factions split, those loyal to Leonor's brood versus those defending the rights of Maria and her lone son. The Queen's anguish. Imagine Maria of Portugal, standing in her cold Castilian palace, watching her rival bask in the affection that should have been hers. She was not merely a neglected wife. She was a humiliated queen. Chronicles describe her as pious and dignified, enduring the insult as best she could, but her isolation was total. She appealed to her father in Portugal, begging for intervention. She wrote to the Pope, decrying her husband's open adultery, but nothing could move Alfonso. To him, Leonor was more than a mistress. She was a queen in all but name, a partner who gave him passion, children, and loyalty. Maria was simply the unfortunate instrument of diplomacy, useful only for producing one son. Alfonso's military brilliance. Here lies the paradox. While his personal life scandalized Europe, Alfonso's reign in other respects was impressive. He led successful campaigns against the Moors, most famously at the Battle of Rio Salado, 1340, where Christian forces decisively defeated a combined Moorish army from Granada and Morocco. His victories made him a hero of the Reconquista, strengthening Christendom's foothold in Iberia. Yet even these triumphs were tainted by whispers. Nobles muttered that Leonor's influence stretched into military appointments, that her relatives gained privileges on the battlefield. Whether true or not, the mere perception that a mistress could sway policy eroded respect for the king. The king who died in love. Alfonso Xi's reign ended suddenly in 1350, when he died of the Black Death while besieging Gibraltar. Even in his final hours, Leonor was by his side. Maria was not. To the very end, Alfonso defied tradition, leaving the memory of his reign tied inseparably to the woman who was never queen. With his death, the succession crisis he had nurtured burst into flame. His legitimate son, Peter of Castile, inherited the throne, but Leonor's children, especially Henry of Trastamara, were not content to remain in the shadows. A brutal civil war followed, pitting brother against brother, mother's honor against mistress's legacy. Leonor herself was seized and executed by order of Queen Maria, vengeance finally delivered. Yet her children triumphed in the end. The Trastamara line would seize the throne and rule Castile for generations. The scandal's legacy. Alfonso Xi's story reveals the dangerous consequences of unchecked passion in medieval monarchy. By elevating Leonor de Guzman above his wife, Alfonso not only humiliated Maria, but destabilized the very foundation of Castile. His lust shaped dynastic politics for a century, turning his private scandal into public bloodshed. Unlike Edward II, whose perversions were whispered and denied, or Philip the Fair, whose scandal engulfed his daughters-in-law, Alfonso's indiscretions were bold and unapologetic. He lived as though love excused all, even at the expense of law, tradition, and diplomacy. His story shows that in the medieval world, the bedchamber could be as dangerous as the battlefield, and sometimes its wounds lasted longer. You step away from the Castilian court, hearing the echoes of Leonor's laughter mingling with Maria's weeping, seeing the shadows of bastard sons sharpening swords for the wars to come. Alfonso Xi may have won glory against Granada, but his greatest legacy was a dynasty forever divided by lust. You drift into the rugged valleys and mountain passes of Navarre, a kingdom perched precariously between France and Spain. The wind tastes of pine resin and cold stone, the rivers are fast and narrow, and everywhere you feel the press of neighboring giants. Navarre was small, but in the 14th century it was ruled by a man whose reputation towered far above his borders, Charles II of Navarre, better known, both then and now, as Charles the Bad. The nickname is no idle slander. Chroniclers in France and Spain alike paint him as deceitful, cruel, and treacherous, a man driven by ambition and an endless appetite for pleasure. Even among medieval monarchs, a crowd not exactly renowned for moral purity, Charles stood out as someone who seemed to make vice his defining characteristic. And though historians still argue whether his reputation has been exaggerated by enemies, the sheer number of accounts of his schemes, his lusts, and his grim death ensure that his memory still carries the stink of both smoke and scandal. A prince of France. Charles II was born in 1332, grandson of Louis X of France through his mother, Jeanne II of Navarre. This gave him not only a claim to the small kingdom of Navarre, but also whispers of a claim to the French throne itself. His father, Philip of Evreux, had been a relatively quiet nobleman, but Charles inherited ambition from his mother's side and a bitter grudge against the French crown. When he ascended as King of Navarre in 1349, Charles was barely 17. He had wealth, noble connections, and charisma. He also had a taste for deception, indulgence, and revenge. French chronicler Jean Froissart, who never passed up a juicy detail, once described Charles as beautiful in body but false of heart, full of dissimulation, and given to every vice. It's the medieval equivalent of calling someone a gorgeous sociopath. The bad reputation. Why the bad? That label, Le Mauvais, stuck to Charles during his lifetime. Some of it came from his political backstabbing. He betrayed allies, cut secret deals with enemies, and switched loyalties whenever it suited him. But his personal appetites played no small role. In an era when kings were expected to at least maintain the appearance of dignity, Charles indulged himself openly. He pursued women relentlessly, both at home in Pamplona and abroad in Paris. He used seduction not merely for pleasure but as a political weapon, seeking to entangle noblewomen whose families could serve his schemes. Court gossip tied his name to mistresses high and low, and some chronicles even accuse him of dabbling in unnatural practices, a vague but damning medieval shorthand for anything outside the expected bounds of heterosexual marital relations. Whether that means affairs with men, occult sexual rites, or simply imaginative bedroom antics, the chroniclers don't say, but they wanted his reputation tarnished. A king who loved poison. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of Charles's lustful life was its overlap with his taste for poison. The man had a reputation for experimenting with herbs, tinctures, and slow-killing venoms. His enemies whispered that he seduced noblewomen not merely for passion, but to test potions on them, or to gain access to their husbands' secrets. One rumor tells of him slipping powders into wine cups, then watching with cool interest as his victim grew pale. Another suggests he kept apothecaries on retainer not for medicine, but for murder. Historians still argue whether these tales were propaganda or fact. What is certain is that Charles cultivated an aura of danger, as though he wanted people to believe he was as deadly in bed as he was in politics. Enemies everywhere. Charles's lusts and betrayals quickly caught up with him. He quarreled with John II of France, whom he both flattered and undermined, sometimes in the same week. He stirred rebellion in Normandy, seduced noblewomen loyal to the French crown, and conspired with the English during the 100 Years' War. When confronted, Charles would smile, offer apologies, and host elaborate feasts, only to betray his hosts days later. It became almost a game for him, his charm luring in allies, his appetites tangling him in scandals, and his poisons leaving trails of suspicion. The French king once had Charles arrested and imprisoned in 1356 after he plotted to assassinate a royal favorite. For most nobles, this would have been the end, but Charles somehow talked and schemed his way out, eventually regaining freedom and power. That slipperiness, that refusal to be caught, only fueled his notoriety. A lust for power and for flesh. Beyond the politics, Charles's reign in Navarre was marked by a court that mirrored its rulers' appetites. Feasts ran long into the night, with wine flowing and dancers summoned from distant lands. Foreign envoys wrote home about the unseemly entertainments of Pamplona, where Charles kept mistresses as openly as hunting hounds. He sired numerous illegitimate children, many recognized and granted lands. His wife, Joan of Valois, a daughter of the French royal house, could do little but watch as Charles flaunted his affairs. Unlike Alfonso, Exai of Castile, who elevated one mistress above all, Charles seemed unable to limit himself. His burning desires were scattered, restless, and hungry for novelty. At least one chronicler claimed that Charles pursued not only women, but also the wives of his own allies, using seduction as a tool to sow division and mistrust. Whether this is exaggerated or not, The man clearly believed that lust could be as sharp a weapon as a sword. The fire at the end. And yet, for all his slippery escapes, Charles could not cheat fate. In 1387, in his mid-50s, Charles II of Navarre fell gravely ill. The treatments available at the time were brutal enough, but in Charles's case, the story takes a macabre turn. According to legend, his doctors prescribed that he be wrapped in a cloth soaked with brandy to restore circulation. The cloth was then sewn tightly around him, almost like a mummy. One night, a careless attendant brought a candle too close. The alcohol-soaked cloth caught fire, and Charles the Bad was consumed in flames. The image is ghastly, almost theatrical. A king known for burning passions, cruelty, and poison, ending in a literal blaze, his screams echoing through the palace halls. Historians still debate whether this account is true or merely a symbolic tale crafted by enemies. But the story stuck because it fit the reputation. Charles had lived as if fire burned inside him, and so fire, fittingly or unfairly, marked his death. Legacy of lust and terror. In the end, Charles II left behind a kingdom weakened by his excesses and surrounded by stronger powers. His children and heirs faced constant pressure from both France and Castile. His name became shorthand for treachery, cruelty, and lust. Few monarchs have carried such a consistently negative epithet through history. And yet, buried beneath the propaganda, there remains the possibility that Charles was more complex, a skilled manipulator in a brutal era, a man whose enemies exaggerated his vices. Still, when chroniclers across nations agree that your reputation is soaked in lust, poison, and betrayal, you probably weren't entirely innocent. You step back from Navarre, the smell of charred wood still clinging to your clothes, the echo of Charles's laughter and his shrieks mingling in your mind. If lust corrupted medieval thrones, in Charles the Bad it seemed to ignite them. You leave behind the fire-lit death of Charles of Navarre and slip across the channel once more, where England hums with gossip, rebellion, and the uneasy footsteps of a queen whose vengeance has become legend. This time, you stand in the shadow of Isabella of France, daughter of Philip the Fair, wife of Edward II, mother of Edward III, and you feel the air around her thick with both humiliation and cold determination. If Edward II embodied royal lust taken to scandalous extremes, then Isabella is the mirror in which his sins reflected back with devastating consequences. You find yourself drawn into her story not simply as a tale of betrayal, but as the unraveling of an entire monarchy through the intimate politics of desire. Isabella had been married off young, as all princesses were. At 12 years old, she was given to Edward II of England, her father hoping to bind England and France more closely together. A child bride in a foreign land, she quickly discovered that her husband's affections belonged not to her, but to a succession of male favorites, most infamously Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. Imagine the humiliation, arriving as the daughter of the most powerful king in Christendom, expected to be the jewel of the English court, only to be sidelined by men who mocked her and flaunted their control over Edward. The chroniclers describe how Gaveston draped himself in silks more splendid than the Queen's, how Despenser sneered at her in council meetings, how Edward openly preferred their company to hers. At first, Isabella endured, as medieval queens were trained to endure. She played her role, gave Edward children, and smiled when duty demanded. But patience can rot into resentment, and over the years resentment hardened into hatred. Edward's misrule compounded her misery. He squandered money on his favorites, alienated nobles, and allowed Despenser's greed to strip lands from barons and even from Isabella herself. Historians still argue whether Edward's orientation truly made him incapable of loving Isabella, or whether his attachment to his favorites was more political than romantic. Either way, the result was the same: a queen isolated, scorned, and plotting in the shadows. By 1325, the situation had become unbearable. Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, the French King Charles IV, over disputed territories. Instead of returning dutifully to England, she lingered. There, free from Edward's household, Isabella's vengeance took root. She struck up a partnership, both political and, according to many, intimate, with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had fled into exile after clashing with the Despensers. Their connection sparked into something far more than convenience. Whether it was love or lust or a perfect alignment of ambition, the result was electric. Isabella had finally found a man willing not only to listen to her, but to act with her. The Queen of England and the rebel baron began raising an army together. Chroniclers whisper about their affair in Parisian chambers, about stolen kisses behind cathedral walls, about Isabella's transformation from wronged wife to avenging fury. You almost picture her as a medieval Lady Macbeth, her soft voice edged with steel, whispering promises of power into Mortimer's ear. Historians debate the depth of their passion, but one thing is certain. Isabella and Mortimer became inseparable, their bond sealing the doom of Edward II. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small invasion force. What should have been a desperate gamble turned into a wave of popular support. Barons, clergy, even common townsfolk flocked to them. Edward had alienated nearly everyone with his devotion to Despenser. Nobles wanted revenge, people wanted stability, and Isabella gave them both. You watch as London erupts in cheers at her arrival, as banners are raised not for the king, but for the queen who dared defy him. The rebellion moved quickly. Edward and Despenser fled but were captured. Here the tale grows darker. Despenser was given over to Isabella's allies, and his fate remains one of the most grotesque executions in English history. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body parts displayed as warnings. Chroniclers linger on the details with almost ghoulish relish, as if punishing Despenser's lust and greed was a kind of national cleansing. Isabella watched her husband's favorite torn apart, a grim satisfaction perhaps in her eyes. One might say this was her vengeance for years of humiliation at Despenser's hands. And Edward himself, the deposed king, was imprisoned, stripped of power, and eventually forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents, effectively king and queen in all but name. For a brief, glittering moment, Isabella had everything she had been denied: authority, respect, and a partner by her side. Court chroniclers record feasts, new alliances, and a queen who strode through Westminster with the air of victory. But you feel the tension even in these descriptions, the sense that lust and power rarely coexist peacefully for long. The final act of Edward II's life is shrouded in mystery, and here your lantern of imagination flickers across uncertain ground. In 1327, Edward died in captivity at Berkeley Castle. The official story spoke of illness, but rumors of murder sprang up instantly. The most infamous tale describes Edward being executed with a red-hot poker thrust into his body, a symbolic punishment for his supposed sodomy. Historians still argue whether this grisly detail is truth or propaganda, a lurid invention meant to smear a disgraced king. What is certain is that Edward's death removed the last obstacle to Isabella and Mortimer's dominance. The queen, who had once been humiliated by her husband's lusts, had now turned his desires into the very tools of his destruction. But vengeance, like desire, burns too hot to last. Isabella and Mortimer's rule quickly soured. They lavished wealth on themselves, sidelined the young king, and alienated many of their former supporters. The very pattern that had doomed Edward now repeated itself under their regency. Whispers spread about Isabella's continued intimacy with Mortimer, about a queen whose passion had led her astray. By 1330, Edward III, now a teenager, staged a coup. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella was spared but forced into a quiet retirement. The avenging queen ended her days in relative obscurity, her power stripped away, her lust and vengeance remembered more vividly than her later piety. As you linger on her story, you sense the irony. Edward II's lust for favorites and Isabella's lust for revenge intertwined like vines strangling a tree, each feeding the other, each dragging the monarchy down. In the quiet of your imagination, you hear Isabella's voice, once soft, then steely, reminding you that desire in a royal bedchamber was never just private pleasure. It was the spark that could ignite kingdoms, topple thrones, and change the course of history. And if you think about it long enough, you realize this isn't merely a tale of betrayal. It's a cautionary murmur from the past. When desire becomes a weapon, no crown is safe upon the head it rests. You find yourself marching now in the dust and thunder of battlefields, where banners whip in the wind and swords glint under the pale sun. The kings you encounter here are not quiet men of cloisters or hidden chambers. They are warriors first, drenched in sweat, steel, and blood. And yet, even amid their campaigns, these rulers carried with them desires that rivaled their appetite for war. It is a strange thing to notice. The same men who charged headlong into cavalry clashes also found time, somehow, to indulge endlessly in their carnal appetites. You trail behind them, half soldier, half courtier, watching how lust and war fused into one reckless march across medieval history. Consider Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. His very name rings with Crusader glory, his image burnished in legend as the perfect Night King. And yet behind that glittering facade lay rumors and whispers that chroniclers love to pass along. Richard spent only a handful of months in England during his entire reign, far preferring the fire and dust of the Holy Land. There, amid sieges and negotiations with Saladin, stories emerged of the king's unusual attachments. Some writers claim Richard shared a bed with King Philip II of France during their youthful alliance, an intimacy that has long sparked debate. Were they merely close friends bound by politics and danger, or something more? Historians still argue whether the language of brotherhood used in chronicles conceals a deeper passion. But what is undeniable is that Richard's appetites, whatever their form, drew him into both loyalty and betrayal, leaving behind a tangle of rumor that sits awkwardly beside his lion-hearted legend. Then you wander to France, where Philip I had already set a precedent for kings putting pleasure above politics. In the late 11th century, Philip scandalized Europe by setting aside his lawful wife, Bertha of Holland, and taking instead a mistress named Berthrade de Montfort, wife of another man. Not just any man, either. She was married to the Count of Anjou. The affair shook alliances to the core, earned Philip excommunication, and left his kingdom diplomatically isolated. Imagine the boldness of it. At a time when the Pope could bend kings to his will, Philip essentially said, "So what? I want her." You stand in his smoky halls, watching Berthrade glide past courtiers with the air of a queen, while the true queen languishes in obscurity. For a while, it seemed Philip's lust might undo the Capetian dynasty entirely. Yet the line endured, proving once again that crowns often survive what reputations do not. And what of the Iberian Peninsula, where kings seemed as devoted to passion as they were to holy war? Sancho IV of Castile, for instance, lived as fiercely in his bed as on his battlefield. His marriage to Maria de Molina was politically crucial, but Sancho did not let the vows of wedlock restrain him. Chronicles describe him as a man constantly entangled with mistresses, producing illegitimate children even while waging campaigns against Granada. Maria, unlike poor Queen Maria of Portugal under Alfonso XI, fought tooth and nail to defend her status and her children's legitimacy. She maneuvered politically, shielded her sons, and endured Sancho's infidelities, proving herself tougher than most of his enemies. You cannot help but smile wryly at the image. A king slashing through Moorish armies by day, only to sneak into another woman's chambers by night, leaving his queen to clean up the diplomatic mess he caused. Across the channel again, you meet Henry II of England, the fiery founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. Known for his volcanic temper and boundless energy, Henry was also notorious for his mistresses. His most famous entanglement, of course, was with Rosamund Clifford, fair Rosamund, whose beauty was said to eclipse every other lady at court. Henry built her a bower at Woodstock, a labyrinth of hedges and walls where she could be hidden away from his formidable queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The legend goes that Eleanor discovered the affair, tracked down Rosamund, and forced her to choose between poison and a dagger. Whether this lurid tale is true or mere invention, it shows how deeply Henry's lusts embedded themselves into popular imagination. To this day, Rosamund's well is still pointed out at Woodstock, a reminder that royal desire could outlive even dynasties. But perhaps the most telling figure among warrior kings is Edward III of England, son of Isabella and Edward II. Unlike his father, Edward wrapped his lust in a more socially acceptable package. He loved women, and many of them. Chroniclers noted his fondness for pretty ladies at court, his gallantry spilling over into flirtations that were not always innocent. His marriage to Philippa of Hainault was affectionate and produced a brood of legitimate children who would shape Europe for centuries. Yet Edward's mistresses, most notably Alice Pervers, caused scandals in his later years. Alice, a commoner, became so powerful through Edward's favor that she influenced lawsuits, commandeered wealth, and mocked courtiers openly. One could argue Edward's battlefield brilliance in the 100 Years' War was dimmed in his old age by his inability to resist her charms. Again you see the pattern, swords and shields in one hand, silken sheets in the other. As you watch these kings, you begin to notice a rhythm. Their lusts were not separate from their warrior image but woven into it. To charge recklessly into battle and to seize a woman desired, both sprang from the same restless hunger, the same belief that rules were made for lesser men. You see it in Richard's whispered relationships, in Philip's brazen adultery, in Sancho's midnight escapades, in Henry's hidden labyrinths. And always consequences followed. Excommunications, rebellions, resentful queens, bastard children claiming thrones. Lust, like war, left scars that outlasted the men themselves. When chroniclers painted their portraits, they did not forget the sieges and the victories, but neither did they forget the mistresses, the scandals, the rumors of poison or secret passageways to hidden bowers. For medieval people, the battlefield and the bedchamber were equally stages upon which kings revealed their true natures. You trudge onward, the clash of swords fading into the rustle of bed curtains, and you wonder whether these men ever saw the difference. Perhaps to them, conquest was conquest, whether of a fortress or a woman's heart, and perhaps in the end, their true legacy was not in crowns or castles but in the tangled webs of passion they left behind. The sound of cathedral bells tolling across medieval Europe sets the stage for this next passage of your journey. Unlike the clash of swords or the roar of feasts, here the atmosphere is heavy with incense, chanting, and the solemn weight of the church. Yet for all its spiritual authority, the church was not a realm untouched by scandal. It was a stage upon which kings paraded their sins, often in open defiance of papal censure. Lust, after all, did not bow to Rome. Kings were expected to embody a sacred role as much as a political one. The coronation liturgy anointed them almost as priest-kings, chosen by God to rule his people. With such a mantle came expectations of morality and fidelity. But in practice, many kings treated their holy vows as lightly as they treated treaties. Their lustful pursuits did not simply scandalize their courts. They forced the church itself into conflict with monarchs who dared to ignore excommunication, spiritual condemnation, or threats of damnation. Take Philip I of France, whose story we glimpsed earlier. His affair with Bertrade de Montfort did not merely upset a few noble families, it shook the entire Christian world. Pope Urban II, the same pope who would later call for the First Crusade, condemned Philip and Bertrade, excommunicating the king. Imagine the spectacle. While Urban preached the liberation of Jerusalem, he also found himself battling a king who treated marriage as optional. Philip's shameless persistence meant he lived years under papal censure, estranged from the sacraments, his court marked with infamy. Chroniclers delighted in depicting him as a king whose bedchamber choices risked the very salvation of his soul. But France had no monopoly on scandal. You journey further into England and meet John, the infamous Bad King John. His reign was one long clash with the Church, culminating in his excommunication by Pope Innocent III. While the dispute officially centered on the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John's lecherous lifestyle only reinforced the Church's portrayal of him as a godless tyrant. Chroniclers accused him of seducing the wives and daughters of his nobles, even of forcing himself upon betrothed maidens. The Church weaponized these tales, painting John not merely as a poor king, but as a perverse one, his sins staining the entire realm. When barons rebelled and forced him to seal Magna Carta, his reputation as a lustful oppressor was already well carved into legend. You can almost hear the hushed whispers in cloisters, kings who openly flaunted mistresses, who abandoned wives, who mocked the sacrament of marriage. Even in Spain, Alfonso IX of Leon found himself at odds with the papacy over his marriages. He wed Teresa of Portugal, only to have the union annulled by the Church on grounds of consanguinity. Then he married Berengella of Castile, which was again declared invalid. Rather than humbling himself, Alfonso resisted, living openly with mistresses and suring illegitimate children. His disregard for papal decrees became a symbol of how royal lust could undermine even the most sacred of laws. Wander northward, and you meet Eric XIV of Sweden, not strictly medieval, but close enough to glimpse how lust and scandal could entwine with madness. Eric notoriously seduced noblewomen, commoners, and even the wives of his officers, sparking outrage in a kingdom already unsettled by his erratic rule. The Lutheran clergy of Sweden thundered against his sins, declaring him unfit to embody Christian kingship. His downfall was hastened not only by his political blunders, but by his insatiable appetites, which earned him the scorn of pulpit and people alike. Closer to Rome itself, the paradox becomes sharper. The papacy condemned kings for their vices, yet it often tolerated or ignored the very same behaviors when political necessity demanded it. Consider Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler whose intellect and ambition made him one of the most fascinating figures of the 13th century. Frederick openly flouted papal authority, earning excommunication more than once. His court in Sicily was notorious for its sensuality, blending Arab, Norman, and Latin influences in a heady mix of philosophy and indulgence. Frederick kept multiple concubines, fathered children across Europe, and was accused of treating marriage merely as a diplomatic tool. Popes raged against him as an antichrist, but his charisma and power meant their condemnations often rang hollow. It is here that you begin to realize something crucial. The Church's role was not simply to condemn lust, but to control it, to bend royal passions into political obedience. When kings obeyed, their sins might be glossed over. When kings defied, every dalliance became a weapon. Philip I's adultery became a scandal because he resisted papal correction. John's lechery became infamous because it fit the image of a tyrant. Frederick's sensual court was condemned precisely because he dared challenge Rome itself. But even when the Church thundered, ordinary people consumed these scandals like entertainment. Pilgrims gossiped about the lustful kings whose souls hung in the balance. Monks recorded the details in manuscripts, and poets used them as moral lessons. The idea of a king sinning in his bedchamber carried symbolic weight. If the monarch, God's chosen, could not control his flesh, what hope was there for the kingdom's morality? A lustful king threatened not only his own salvation, but that of his entire people. And yet, perversely, these very scandals fed the aura of kingship. To flaunt the Church and still hold power was itself a show of dominance. Lust became a form of rebellion, a way to assert that kings were above the rules. Some chroniclers hated this arrogance, while others, secretly perhaps, admired it. You leave the cloisters with a strange taste in your mouth. Incense mixed with gossip, holiness mingled with sin. The Church tried to be the great restrainer, the voice of morality, the scourge of lustful kings. But time and again, lust proved stronger than decrees, stronger than threats of hellfire. The papal condemnations echo even now in your memory. Yet so too do the laughter and whispers of kings who knew that desire, once awakened, could never be silenced by bells or bands. You drift further into the echoing corridors of royal chambers, this time stepping onto the stone floors of Tudor England. The tapestries glow with flickering candlelight, woven with battles, saints, and allegories of virtue. But behind the threads lies a tale that is anything but virtuous. Here, lust does not merely scandalize, it reshapes the very foundations of church and state. You are entering the world of Henry VIII, a king whose insatiable desire for both power and passion tore England from Rome, created new churches, and sent queens to their graves. The story begins with a young Henry, golden-haired, athletic, beloved by his people. Chroniclers painted him as the ideal Renaissance prince, skilled in hunting, jousting, music, and languages. But what they rarely gloss over is his weakness for women. He was not just a king who needed an heir. He was a man whose lust, mingled with paranoia, left a trail of broken hearts and severed heads. You stand in his chambers now, the air perfumed with rosemary, roses, and fear. At first, Henry was devoted to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Married to her after his elder brother Arthur's death, Henry defended her against whispers of illegitimacy and stood by her side for 2 decades. But as years passed without a surviving male heir, his patience with her waned. Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary, but Henry saw no secure future in a female line. The frustration grew into obsession. Henry believed God had cursed their union. Historians still argue whether this was genuine conviction or convenient excuse, but either way, Henry's desire for another woman transformed his theology into destiny. That woman, of course, was Anne Boleyn. You picture her now, dark-eyed and sharp-tongued, holding Henry's heart in her hand. Unlike mistresses who came before, Anne refused to be just another dalliance. She demanded marriage, a crown, legitimacy. Henry was so enthralled by her charms that he did what few monarchs had dared before. He broke with the Pope. For 1,000 years, Rome had been the supreme arbiter of Christian marriage. Yet Henry, driven by lust and ambition, declared himself the head of the Church of England, granting his own annulment. Think about the sheer audacity of this move. Monarchs had fought popes before, but Henry institutionalized his defiance, creating an entire church so he could bed and wed Anne. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 was not born from lofty theology, but from the primal urge of one king to satisfy his desires. The English Reformation, with all its wars, persecutions, and martyrs, can trace its roots to Henry's bedchamber. You probably won't survive that realization without shaking your head at how fragile history really is. Of course, Anne's story did not end in triumph. Once Henry had her, her allure began to fade. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day be one of England's greatest monarchs, but failed to provide a son. Henry's affection turned to suspicion, then to fury. Court rivals whispered tales of adultery, treason, and witchcraft. Historians still argue whether Anne was guilty of anything beyond failing to produce a male heir, but the outcome was sealed. She was executed in 1536. You almost hear the thud of the French swordsman's blade as Henry, now free again, turned his gaze elsewhere. The cycle repeated. Henry married Jane Seymour, who finally bore him a son, Edward. But Jane died shortly after childbirth, and Henry, grief-stricken yet restless, sought comfort in more marriages. There was Anne of Cleves, whom he found so unattractive that he annulled the match within months, calling her the Flanders mare. There was Catherine Howard, young, lively, and disastrously unfaithful. She too lost her head, condemned for adultery. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, who survived him by outliving him. What ties all of these marriages together is not just Henry's personal desire, but the enormous political ripples they caused. Each queen brought alliances or enmities, shifts in factional power, and reshaped England's foreign policy. Each annulment, execution, or remarriage destabilized the court. Lust and paranoia were not private matters, they were national crises. And yet the mistresses must not be forgotten. Henry was known for discreet liaisons, including Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. Mary bore him at least one illegitimate child, though Henry never publicly acknowledged any bastards. This restraint is curious. Other kings proudly recognized their illegitimate offspring. Was Henry unusually cautious, or did he fear undermining the legitimacy of his official heirs? Historians still argue over this puzzle, debating whether Henry's control of his public image was deliberate or instinctive. Imagine the gossip in the corridors of Hampton Court, where servants carried trays of wine while whispering about who warmed the king's bed that night. Imagine the bishops, torn between outrage and complicity, drafting theological justifications for Henry's decisions. Imagine the ordinary people, who had no choice but to follow their king's lust-driven reforms, watching monasteries dissolve and churches transform around them. For them, Henry's passion was not romantic. It was disruptive, frightening, and unavoidable. Henry's story also shines a light on how desire intertwined with gender expectations. Queens were executed for suspected affairs, while kings flaunted their mistresses with little consequence. Yet Henry's wives lived under constant surveillance, their wombs treated as state property. To fail at childbearing was to risk death. The double standard could not be clearer, and you feel the weight of that injustice pressing through the centuries. Quirky tidbits only make the story stranger. Did you know Henry once ordered a special jousting outfit designed to impress Anne Boleyn, embroidered with her initials? Or that he kept his court astrologers busy predicting the likelihood of male heirs, as if the stars could bend to his will? Chroniclers even claimed Henry composed love songs for Anne, strumming on the lute like a smitten youth, despite being the most powerful man in England. You can almost laugh at the absurdity, if not for the blood that followed. And then there's the scholarly debate that lingers like smoke. Was Henry truly driven by lust or by dynastic desperation? Some historians argue he feared civil war if he left only a daughter as heir, haunted by memories of the Wars of the Roses. Others insist his obsession with Anne was simply too consuming to ignore. Perhaps the truth lies in both. Lust provided the spark, ambition the fuel, and paranoia the fire. Together, they forged a new England. As you leave Henry's chambers, you notice how quiet the tapestries seem. The feasts, the music, the laughter, all gone. What remains is the echo of a king whose lust reshaped an entire church, whose paranoia destroyed queens, and whose desires changed history forever. Lust was not just his weakness, it was his revolution. You step now through an arched doorway draped in silks, the air heavy with musk and sandalwood. A faint clinking of bracelets, the soft swish of embroidered slippers, and the hushed giggles of women behind carved lattice screens drift toward you. Here, in the shadows of harems, mistresses, chambers, and private boudoirs, medieval politics found its most intimate battlefield. This is not the battlefield of spears and banners, but of glances, touches, and whispered promises, where lust becomes strategy and desire reshapes dynasties. Behind jeweled screens, kings entertain more than wives. In courts from Spain to the Ottoman world, the architecture of power literally included these hidden rooms. You find yourself in the harem of the Sultan, where corridors twist into an endless maze. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a space of pleasure, a realm of silken pillows, perfumed baths, and courtesans trained in song and poetry. But look closer, and you see how much power lies here. The women of the harem were not merely objects of desire. They were conduits of influence, shaping succession and policy in ways few official ministers could. Take the Ottoman court, where the Sultanate of women flourished between the 16th and 17th centuries. While it spills just beyond the strict medieval timeframe, its roots were deeply medieval. The mothers of sultans, known as Valide sultans, often wielded enormous influence. A favorite concubine could rise from obscurity to become the mother of a future ruler, and once she held that position, she had the ear of the most powerful man in the empire. Though European chroniclers often dismissed the harem as a den of sin, in truth, it was a political machine fueled by desire. Every kiss was a negotiation. Every child born was a potential heir. Move westward, and you arrive in medieval France, where kings kept maîtresses en titre, official royal mistresses whose power rivaled that of queens. Though the title became more formal in the Renaissance, the practice was well established centuries earlier. Imagine the jealousy simmering between a queen, bound by duty, and a mistress, adored for passion. Kings often lavished lands, titles, and gifts on their lovers, weaving them into the fabric of governance. Some mistresses used this influence to advance their families, secure alliances, or sabotage rivals. One might joke that France's foreign policy was often decided not in the council chamber, but in the royal bedchamber. Even England was not immune. While Henry VIII's story is already notorious, other monarchs indulged too. Edward III, for instance, was said to be deeply enamored of Alice Perrers, a woman of relatively humble birth. Alice used her relationship with the king to gain jewels, lands, and political sway. Chroniclers condemned her as greedy and manipulative, portraying her as a symbol of royal corruption. Historians still argue whether she was truly the villain she appeared to be, or whether male chroniclers simply couldn't stomach a woman wielding such visible influence. Either way, her presence shows that behind every king's public image, there was often a woman whose private hold on him shaped decisions of state. You wander further and find the darker side of these hidden chambers. Not every mistress was a willing partner. Some were coerced, pressured by families, or simply unable to refuse the advances of a king who held their fate in his hands. For every celebrated love affair, there were tragedies. Women discarded once their beauty faded, children left in political limbo, reputations ruined beyond repair. These stories rarely made it into official chronicles, but if you press your ear against the walls, you might hear them still. Of course, the role of mistresses in harems was not limited to scandal. It often intersected with succession crises. If a king favored one mistress's child over another, or if a concubine maneuvered her son into the line of succession, entire kingdoms could erupt in conflict. Succession wars were not only about law and bloodlines, but also about who had captured a king's heart in the secrecy of his chambers. A quirky detail emerges in Spain. King Alfonso X of Castile had a notorious mistress, Leonor de Guzman, with whom he had 10 children. Rather than hiding her, he openly favored her over his legitimate queen. After Alfonso's death, Leonor's sons fought bitterly with his legitimate heir, Pedro the Cruel, plunging Castile into civil strife. Imagine the awkwardness of court feasts, where half-brothers eyed each other across the table, knowing that their mother's place in the king's bed had determined their right to rule. Meanwhile, in distant courts, other forms of intimacy shaped politics. In China's Ming dynasty and Japan's imperial courts, concubines played roles similar to Europe's mistresses, though embedded within strict ritual hierarchies. Though beyond Europe, these examples remind you that across the world, desire and dynasty were entangled threads. The chambers of kings, wherever they were, became theaters of power. You pause to consider how chroniclers wrote about these women. Often, they demonized mistresses as temptresses, blaming them for leading kings astray. The pattern is almost predictable. If a reign faltered, a mistress was accused of distracting the monarch, wasting the treasury, or whispering bad advice. If a reign prospered, her influence was minimized or erased. Historians still argue whether this bias reflects real corruption or the simple misogyny of the times. Picture the gossip now. Servants rushing through hallways whispering, "The king has chosen her tonight." Courtiers plotting, hopping to gain favor through a mistress's smile. Queens weeping behind locked doors, their dignity shredded by the king's latest infatuation. Behind jeweled lattice screens, human desire burned brightly, reshaping policies, igniting wars, and leaving legacies carved in both scandal and stone. And what of the kings themselves? For them, these arrangements were double-edged swords. On one hand, keeping mistresses allowed them to indulge their desires without always destabilizing their official marriages. On the other hand, mistresses could become liabilities, creating factions, resentment, and reputational damage. A king might hope to keep his private life private, but in medieval courts, nothing stayed secret for long. Every glance, every embrace, every child born outside wedlock was fodder for rumor, politics, and history itself. Quirky tidbits surfaced like jewels from a chest. Did you know some kings built elaborate tunnels or hidden staircases to reach their mistresses' chambers unseen? In certain castles, secret passageways still exist, leading from the royal bedchamber to nearby rooms, architectural proof that secrecy was built into stone. Or consider the curious case of embroidered handkerchiefs. Mistresses often gave them to kings as tokens, only for them to become symbols of scandal when discovered by jealous queens. You can almost laugh, imagining a medieval monarch brought down by something as small as a square of linen. And yet the weight of it all presses down. Behind jeweled lattice screens, desire was never truly private. It was a force that bent politics, shaped successions, and carved reputations. The chambers you walk through are not simply rooms of passion but halls of power, their silken pillows soaked with the sweat of history. The candle gutters low as you move into a colder, sharper corridor of royal history. The velvet and silks of mistresses' chambers fade away, and instead you find yourself standing in the echo of words, whispers, rumors, and accusations sharpened into weapons. For if kings indulged their lusts, their enemies learned quickly that scandal was one of the deadliest blades at hand. You see, a king's bedchamber was never just a private space. It was a battlefield where reputations could be destroyed, alliances shattered, and power overturned, all without a single sword being drawn. Imagine the medieval court as a hall of mirrors, every polished surface reflecting and distorting reality. In this place, even a rumor of adultery could be enough to undermine a monarch's authority. And those rumors did not sprout on their own. They were carefully cultivated, watered, and spread by rivals who knew exactly how fragile the illusion of sanctity was. Scandal became political currency, traded and spent to weaken opponents. You, walking among these shadows, begin to understand that gossip was as powerful as armies. Take King Richard II of England, for example. His reign was plagued by whispers that cut into his very identity. Chroniclers hostile to him painted him as effeminate, overly fond of his male companions, and unfit for kingship. Some even suggested he indulged in improper relations, though evidence remains murky. Whether true or not, these rumors eroded his image as a strong ruler, making it easier for his cousin Henry Bolingbroke to usurp him. Historians still argue whether Richard's downfall was driven more by his poor politics or by the corrosive force of scandal carefully fanned by enemies who knew how to manipulate perception. Or consider Louis XVI of France, centuries later but inheritor of the same tradition. His mistresses became the talk of Europe, with pamphlets, songs, and caricatures mocking him for indulging in pleasure while his kingdom suffered. Though not strictly medieval, Louis's example reveals the continuity of scandal as weaponry. Rulers could survive wars, but not ridicule. In medieval times, when kings were supposed to embody virtue, scandal made them look weak, corrupt, and unworthy of God's blessing. Step back into the earlier Middle Ages, and you find the case of King John of England again. His enemies used tales of his lust not only to attack his morality, but to undermine his authority with his own barons. Chroniclers accused him of seducing the wives and daughters of his nobles, sometimes by force. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories provided his enemies with ammunition. After all, what noble could trust a king who violated his household? When the barons rose against him and demanded Magna Carta, the image of a lustful, predatory monarch was already etched into his reputation. And then there's the infamous Tour de Nesle affair in France. You've heard this one before. 3 princesses, accused of adultery with knights, exposed in scandal that shook the Capetian dynasty. But pause and think, who benefited? The scandal was uncovered by Philip the Fair's daughter Isabella, Queen of England, whose motives were not merely moral but political. By accusing her sisters-in-law, she weakened France's succession, ensuring that her son Edward III might one day claim the French throne. The entire 100 years, war can trace its roots, at least in part, to a scandal weaponized for dynastic gain. Gossip became not just entertainment, but the spark for generations of conflict. It's important to notice how gender shaped this weapon. Queens and noblewomen were often the targets of sexual scandal, their reputations shredded to damage the men connected to them. A king accused of lust might be called immoral, but a queen accused of adultery could delegitimize her children and destroy dynastic stability. Enemies knew this well. To topple a woman's honor was to unravel a king's authority. In medieval courts, reputation was as fragile as glass, and scandal was the hammer waiting to strike. You pass by shelves of manuscripts, their inked margins filled with satire. Chroniclers relished describing rulers' vices, not always out of loyalty to truth, but because such tales served political narratives. Imagine monks, quills scratching in dim light, writing that a king was bewitched by a mistress, or that his desires had led him astray. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others were fabricated entirely. Historians still argue over how much we can trust medieval sources, given how often scandal was deliberately manufactured. One quirky tidbit: in 14th century Florence, political rivals sometimes hired poets to write bawdy verses mocking their opponents' supposed lusts. These verses would be performed in public squares, blending entertainment with defamation. Now picture the medieval equivalent of viral gossip, crowds laughing as a poet lampooned a powerful figure's bedroom habits, spreading scandal faster than any courier could carry a letter. If you thought medieval people lacked humor, you probably won't survive that image of a crowd chuckling over rhymed insults, while power trembled on its foundations. The weaponization of scandal also appears in papal politics. Popes often excommunicated kings for defiance, but accompanying the formal decrees were carefully planted rumors about their vices. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, was branded the Antichrist, not just for his political resistance, but for his supposed lechery, blasphemy, and indulgence. Whether he truly lived as wildly as described remains uncertain, but the smear campaign served its purpose: to weaken his moral authority in the eyes of Europe. But scandal could backfire. Sometimes, kings leaned into their reputations, turning them into a form of dominance. Consider Charles II of England, far later but illustrative, nicknamed the Merry Monarch. He flaunted his mistresses openly. His charisma turned what could have been damaging into a defining feature of his reign. Medieval rulers occasionally did the same, using rumors of virility to project strength, as if a bustling bedchamber proved their vigor as rulers. Scandal in such cases became paradoxically useful. As you walk further, you sense how delicate this game was. To accuse a king of lust could be treasonous, but to ignore it could leave rivals powerless. To exaggerate a queen's scandal could topple dynasties, but also risk backlash if she proved innocent. The corridors of power rang with whispers, every word a potential dagger. Historians still debate whether medieval people believed all the scandals they heard, or whether they accepted them as political theater. Were they gullible or knowingly complicit in enjoying the spectacle? Perhaps both. After all, scandal satisfies a basic human appetite: the thrill of peeking behind the curtain of power, of discovering that even kings are flawed, even queens are vulnerable. Medieval audiences, much like us, consumed scandal hungrily. Picture now the courts, banners flying outside, but inside, hushed conversations over goblets of wine. A courtier leans close, murmuring about the king's newest infatuation. Another spreads the tale of a queen's supposed affair. Within days, the story has spread from chamber to chamber, monastery to marketplace. By the time it reaches the ears of the people, it has grown larger, darker, and more dangerous. Scandal, once unleashed, could not be contained. And you realize, as you linger in this corridor of whispers, that lust was not the only corruption of medieval thrones. It was the scandal about lust, weaponized, sharpened, and hurled like an arrow that often decided who rose and who fell. In the end, desire might have corrupted kings, but it was rumor that destroyed them. You step into a chamber thick with the smell of overindulgence, roasted meats, spilled wine, perfumed smoke. The hall is alive with laughter, shouting, and the pounding of goblets on heavy wooden tables. Yet beneath the raucous noise, you sense a kind of rot, the ruinous weight of kings who mistook indulgence for immortality. If scandal was one blade, then excess itself was another, and many medieval rulers bled themselves dry on it. Here, power and pleasure became so entangled that kings could not separate their crowns from their cravings, and their downfall was written not in battlefields, but in banquet halls and bedrooms. Excess in its purest form was not just about lust. It was about eating too much, drinking too much, spending too much, taking too much. But lust was often the brightest jewel in the crown of overindulgence. A king who gorged himself on feasts might also surround himself with dozens of mistresses. A monarch who squandered treasure on wars might pour the same into building secret palaces for his pleasures. To live excessively was to treat the throne as a private playground, and sooner or later, the kingdom always paid the price. Consider the case of Edward II of England. History remembers him less for military triumphs than for his disastrous reign, marred by favoritism and indulgence. His close relationships with men like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser caused outrage among his nobles, not only because of rumors of intimacy, but because Edward showered them with wealth and privilege, leaving the rest of the court resentful. Edward's excess was not subtle. He flaunted his attachments, defying the political balance his ancestors had maintained. His downfall, imprisonment, and eventual murder, rumored to be by a red-hot poker, though likely propaganda, reveal how indulgence made him vulnerable. A king could survive enemies, but not the perception that he valued pleasure more than duty. Then there's Charles VI of France, the Mad King. His reign was marked by episodes of psychosis, but even beyond his mental instability, his court spiraled into excess. Nobles indulged in endless tournaments, masquerades, and extravagant entertainments while France slid toward ruin. One infamous event, the Bal des Ardents Ball of the Burning Men, epitomized the peril of indulgence. During a masquerade, Charles and his companions dressed as wild men and danced, only for their costumes to catch fire. Several burned to death before the horrified court. Here was excess as spectacle, pleasure transforming into tragedy, and a kingdom reminded that a monarch's indulgence could ignite catastrophe both literally and politically. Across the Alps, Sigismund of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor, reveled in grandeur. His court was notorious for its extravagance, with feasts that consumed the wealth of cities and tournaments designed to dazzle rather than govern. Chroniclers mocked him as the emperor of many titles but little substance. He, like so many, seemed convinced that magnificence and excess equated to power. Yet behind the glitter lay debt, unrest, and political weakness that his successors struggled to repair. His indulgence outlived him in the form of instability. But no monarch better embodies the lethal marriage of lust and excess than Henry VIII of England. Though strictly a Renaissance king, he is heir to medieval traditions of indulgence. His pursuit of wives, 6 in total, was as much about lust and vanity as about dynastic necessity. Each marriage destabilized alliances, provoked wars, or triggered religious upheaval. His banquets were legendary, his spending reckless, his appetites insatiable. By the end of his reign, he was obese, paranoid, and tyrannical, his once vigorous body a decaying symbol of excess unchecked. Though outside the strict medieval period, Henry shows where this path led, to the destruction of monasteries, the execution of queens, and the reshaping of a nation's faith, all because one king could not master his desires. In earlier centuries, Alfonso XI of Castile offers another telling example. He openly favored his mistress, Leonor de Guzman, over his queen, Maria of Portugal, showering her and her children with lands, titles, and influence. His court fumed at the blatant favoritism, and after his death, Leonor was captured and executed on the queen's orders. Alfonso's excess in elevating his mistress above dynastic duty planted seeds of division that would fracture Castile's future. His indulgence did not just taint his legacy, it set fire to the political balance of an entire realm. You notice a pattern forming. Excess was rarely private. It bled into politics, alliances, and wars. A king who spent lavishly on mistresses left his soldiers unpaid. A ruler who gorged himself on feasts weakened his body, making him vulnerable to illness. A monarch who flaunted lust risked insulting nobles whose loyalty he desperately needed. In a society where kingship was bound tightly to ideas of virtue and God's favor, indulgence was dangerous not only materially but spiritually. A sinful king was seen as inviting divine punishment upon his kingdom. Droughts, plagues, and defeats could all be blamed on a ruler's excess. This belief in divine retribution amplified every scandal. When famine struck, people whispered that God punished the king's lust. When war was lost, chroniclers linked it to indulgence. Kings became living symbols, and their private failings were magnified into cosmic disasters. Imagine being a peasant hearing of the king's latest feast while your village starved. You would not see indulgence as harmless, but as proof of corruption poisoning the realm. The church, too, played its part in this drama. Preachers thundered against lustful kings, warning that their excess would doom the people. Monastic writers cataloged rulers' sins, weaving them into moral lessons. A king who indulged in too many mistresses became a cautionary tale. His downfall was framed as divine justice. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, they reinforced the narrative that indulgence led inevitably to ruin. Yet some kings seemed to thrive on excess, at least for a while. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, surrounded himself with luxury and orchestrated grand displays of wealth. His reign was marked by ruthlessness rather than collapse. But even here, indulgence carried a price. His pursuit of wealth through the destruction of the Knights Templar may have enriched his crown, but it left a shadow of infamy. The myth of the Templar curse, that his dynasty would fall, became a way for contemporaries to explain the subsequent disasters of his sons' reigns. Excess, even when seemingly successful, planted seeds of downfall. You pause at the image of Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, whose reign was notorious for drunkenness and neglect of duty. Chroniclers depict him as preferring wine and pleasures to governance, leaving his kingdom in chaos. His nobles eventually deposed him, tired of a monarch who lived for indulgence rather than responsibility. Wenceslaus stands as a stark reminder. Excess was not merely immoral, it was fatal to authority. Yet as you reflect, you realize excess was not only destructive, but also performative. Monarchs often indulged publicly as a display of power. A massive feast showed that a king's resources were endless. A parade of mistresses suggested virility and dominance. These displays reinforced authority until they tipped into absurdity. The line between power and ridicule was perilously thin. Take Louis the Fat, Louis VI of France. His size became both a symbol of excess and a tool of propaganda. Chroniclers alternately mocked his girth and praised it as a sign of abundance. His body itself became a political statement. Was it proof of prosperity or decadence? In medieval thought, even flesh could carry meaning, and excess carved itself into the very body of kings. Walking deeper into this chamber, you see that downfall was not always swift. Excess often eroded slowly, like water wearing stone. A king grew complacent, fat, and despised. Nobles whispered, enemies pressed. The people grew restless. Then, seemingly overnight, the throne toppled, but its fall had been prepared for years by indulgence. Excess was a slow poison, not always fatal at first sip, but inevitably deadly in accumulation. You drift onward, as if carried by the whispering pages of half-burnt chronicles, into a quieter, more doubtful chamber of memory. Here, not everything is solid stone or gilded throne. This room is mist and rumor, ink blotched with uncertainty. For while some kings' lusts were as obvious as banquet tables groaning under roasted swans, others survive in our knowledge only as shadows, embroidered by chroniclers who may have sharpened their quills not for accuracy, but for scandal. Were all these rulers truly so depraved, or have centuries of gossip carved lustful statues out of flesh and blood men? That is the uneasy question hanging in this space. You glance across walls painted with contradictory images. One mural shows Edward II clasping his favorite peers Gaveston in a too intimate embrace. Another shows them merely as loyal companions. Which is the truth? Historians still argue whether Edward's so-called perversions were fact, exaggeration, or propaganda weaponized by barons who despised his favoritism. The chronicler's pen could kill as effectively as a sword, staining reputation long after the body was gone. This blur between fact and invention is not unique to Edward. Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, offers another puzzle. Some records insist his cruelty extended into sexual vice, painting him as a sadist who used desire as a tool of domination. Others describe him more as a schemer obsessed with power than with carnal sins. Which version is truer? The truth, perhaps, lies tangled between them. But gossip sticks more tightly than truth, and so Charles became, for posterity, a creature of both cruelty and lust. Medieval chroniclers had motives. Many were monks, cloistered men who measured kingship by the yardstick of Christian morality. To them, even a ruler's mild flirtations could swell into damning sin. When a king neglected his queen, it was not simply a family matter, but evidence that he had failed in God's eyes. The chronicler's voice, shaped by piety, often painted rulers in darker tones than perhaps they lived. And yet you cannot dismiss it outright, for kings were men of flesh, not saints, and temptation wove itself through their courts like ivy on stone. The Tour de Nesle affair in France illustrates how slippery this ground can be. Chroniclers tell us that Philip IV's daughters-in-law carried on brazen affairs with knights, discovered through the accidental dropping of a silken purse. But historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated or even fabricated to shame the Capetian dynasty. The women were imprisoned, humiliated, and in some cases executed, while their lovers met grisly fates. Were they truly guilty, or did political enemies manufacture scandal? You realize the same question could apply to kings themselves. Did their lusts topple them, or did enemies amplify whispers into thunder? One quirky tidbit stands out. Medieval poets often delighted in lampooning rulers with bawdy humor, exaggerating their supposed lusts in verses sung in taverns or marketplaces. Imagine a wandering minstrel cheekily describing a king as more occupied with his mistress than his counsel. It spread faster than official proclamations. In some ways, these ribald songs were medieval tabloids, keeping rumor alive long after the court scribes closed their books. And so you find yourself pondering the mechanics of medieval scandal. Unlike today's paparazzi, there were no photographs, no leaked letters, no recordings. All rested on words, chroniclers, gossip, sermons. A ruler's reputation could tilt dramatically depending on which pen scratched his story. Kingship itself became vulnerable to myth-making. Take Louis the Fat again. Chroniclers alternately mocked his girth as proof of gluttony or praised it as abundance incarnate. Was he truly an overindulgent eater, or merely a large man who lived in a culture that linked body size to morality? Historians still argue whether his corpulence was evidence of vice or simply physical reality turned symbolic by his enemies. The same happens with lust. Sometimes it was not what kings did, but how others chose to interpret it. A more haunting example is Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Dracula. While technically a 15th century ruler at the tail end of the medieval world, his reputation was shaped not only by his bloody punishments, but also by whispers of sadistic pleasure in cruelty. Did he truly revel carnally in torture, as later pamphlets suggested, or was this a lurid invention of his enemies, particularly the Saxon merchants who despised him? The debate still stirs among historians, And once again you see how lust and excess blur into propaganda. At times, even the church contributed to myth-making. When a ruler fell out of papal favor, accusations of lust and vice often accompanied the condemnation. The narrative was neat. Sinful kings lost divine blessing and their misfortunes proved it. It is a tidy moral arc, but you wonder whether reality was so straightforward. After all, plenty of lustful rulers survived long reigns, while pious ones fell swiftly. Yet chroniclers, eager for divine symmetry, often reshaped history to fit theological lessons. You imagine yourself sitting with a medieval scribe, his candle flickering, his quill scratching across vellum. He leans in and whispers, "This king, he was consumed by women. His passions ruled him." But what if he never actually saw it? What if he repeated gossip, rumors carried by envoys, court rivals, or tavern chatter? You realize you are listening not to the king himself, but to an echo chamber centuries old. And still, truth and exaggeration were not mutually exclusive. Many kings truly did live lustfully. Henry VIII, Edward II, Alfonso XI, they left tangible consequences: wars, illegitimate heirs, upheaval. But others may have been smeared beyond recognition. The line between genuine scandal and political fiction is so thin that sometimes the shadow outlives the man. You smirk at a small, strange detail. Medieval manuscripts occasionally included marginal doodles, tiny monks, animals, or lovers in compromising positions. Some scholars suggest these cartoons hinted at how contemporaries process scandal. Humor and satire softened the weight of royal vice. Imagine leafing through a chronicle of dynastic collapse only to find, in the corner, a rabbit chasing a man with a frying pan. It's almost as if even medieval scribes couldn't resist poking fun at power gone astray. But you cannot laugh too long because the stakes were deadly. Rumor could topple a dynasty as effectively as an army. When the Capetian line faltered after the Tour de Nesle affair, whispers of lust and betrayal gave rivals ammunition. In England, Edward II's reputation for indulgence justified rebellion. In Bohemia, Wenceslaus IV's supposed drunken excess provided nobles the excuse to depose him. Was every detail true? Perhaps not. But perception mattered more than reality. You step back, realizing that history is not just what happened. It is what people believed happened. Kings may or may not have indulged in unspeakable lusts, but if their people believed it, the effect was the same. Legitimacy drained away, respect collapsed, enemies grew bold. Truth and fiction, fact and fable, they braided together into the same rope that dragged rulers down. And so this chamber of shadows leaves you unsettled. You came in seeking clarity, hoping to separate true lust from exaggerated rumor. Instead, you leave with the awareness that in medieval courts, the two were inseparable. Excess was both lived and imagined, both real and embroidered. A king might fall for his desires, or for the stories told about them. And centuries later, you can still feel the heat of those whispers, echoing as if they were fact. You drift forward, past the medieval tapestries heavy with lions and saints, into halls where velvet curtains shimmer with Renaissance light and Baroque grandeur. The crowns have changed shape. The palaces have grown taller, but the old whisper remains. Kings cannot escape desire, and desire cannot help but shape kingdoms. The legacy of medieval lust did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It spilled forward, winding itself into the veins of later courts like rich wine seeping into a carpet. The Renaissance and Baroque eras did not abandon medieval indulgence. They magnified it, made it theatrical, and sometimes disguised it in philosophy or art. You wander through this new world, where courtiers wear ruffs like starched halos and chandeliers blaze with candles. The air smells of roses, musk, and ambition. Here, desire is not always hidden. It often parades openly as magnificence. If the medieval king risked his reputation by flaunting lust, Renaissance monarchs often wrapped it in spectacle and power. A royal mistress was no longer a shameful secret but a courtly institution, practically with her own office and staff. The medieval pattern, lust turning into politics, evolved, but the danger remained. Think first of Francis I of France. the Renaissance monarch who styled himself as a patron of the arts and a new Caesar. Chroniclers delighted in recounting his virility, boasting that he was the father and restorer of letters, but also hinting that he fathered far more children than he could count. His court was known for its refined pleasures, yet behind the tapestries, the old medieval logic held true. His obsession with women and magnificence drained coffers and sparked jealousy among nobles. Historians still argue whether his reputation as a lustful king was exaggerated by enemies, but the imagery stuck. Francis as both warrior and womanizer, inheritor of the medieval tradition of indulgence. Then your steps carry you to Henry IV of France, nicknamed the Green Gallant. He openly kept mistresses, most famously Gabrielle d'Estrées, whose influence was so great that he nearly married her against political advice. In Henry's time, a mistress was not simply a lover but a political actor, wielding influence, granting favors, shaping decisions. It was the medieval pattern of queens betrayed and mistresses elevated, now elevated to ritual. The king's bedchamber had become as much a battlefield as Agincourt or Crecy once were. Across the Channel, the Tudors and Stuarts carried forward their medieval inheritance. You've already walked with Henry VIII, but his daughter Elizabeth I reveals a curious twist. She never married, styling herself the Virgin Queen. Yet her court was drenched in flirtation, rumor, and sensual display. Was this abstinence or indulgence in another form, lust transformed into politics, flirtation weaponized for power? Historians still argue whether Elizabeth truly kept her vow of chastity or whether she, like her father, indulged privately. Either way, the performance of desire, or its absence, defined her reign. Here is another echo of medieval traditions: sexuality as both a weapon and a liability, endlessly scrutinized. You smirk at a quirky detail. In Elizabeth's court, courtiers often wrote poetry comparing her to a goddess, sometimes in ways that sound suspiciously like love letters. Imagine writing sonnets about your boss today. It would feel absurd. But in the Renaissance, this courtly play was politics, echoing the medieval tradition of courtly love poetry where knights adored queens from afar. Desire was rehearsed, staged, and endlessly debated. And then you arrive at the Baroque courts, where indulgence became practically an art form. None more so than Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His Versailles was not just a palace but a theater of desire, where hundreds of courtiers competed for royal favor while the king himself paraded his mistresses openly. Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon, their names shimmer like characters from a stage play. Here, the medieval suspicion of lust had mutated into spectacle. Yet the danger still lingered. Whispers of orgies, poisons, and satanic rituals swirled in the affair of the poisons, a scandal that revealed how fragile even the most magnificent monarch could be when lust crossed into the realm of rumor. Louis XIV's court also crystallizes the open scholarly debate. Was his display of mistresses truly about passion, or was it another form of control, showing courtiers that his desires shaped the rhythm of the realm? Historians still argue whether his love life was indulgence or deliberate theater. But either way, the medieval inheritance remained. A king's lust was never private. Moving east, you encounter Peter the Great of Russia, a ruler who dragged his kingdom into modernity but carried forward medieval indulgence in his private life. He drank heavily, kept mistresses, and flaunted excess, even as he demanded discipline from his subjects. His transformation of Russia into a European power was intertwined with his personal appetites. Like medieval kings before him, Peter embodied contradiction, visionary reformer and reckless sensualist. Even stranger, in the courts of Central and Eastern Europe, rulers sometimes adopted both medieval austerity and Renaissance indulgence at once. In Poland, Sigismund III Vasa tried to maintain Catholic orthodoxy while his court whispered of his indulgences. In the Habsburg realms, emperors commissioned magnificent palaces but were mocked for their appetites. The line between sanctity and sin, austerity and indulgence, blurred as it had centuries before. You pause on a particularly strange anecdote. In 17th century France, King Louis XIII supposedly despised women, yet was rumored to keep an unusual number of male favorites. Historians still argue whether this was true or slander spread by enemies. The echoes of Edward II return. Was this reality or the weaponization of rumor? The medieval habit of using sexuality to tarnish rulers endured into the Baroque. And so you realize that Renaissance and Baroque rulers lived in a paradox. They inherited medieval suspicion of lust, yet flaunted desire as magnificence. They dressed their passions in silks and masquerades, but the consequences were the same: scandal, rebellion, instability. Some, like Louis XIV, managed to turn excess into control. Others, like Charles II of Spain, were undone by it. Even the Enlightenment could not erase this inheritance. Voltaire mocked rulers for hypocrisy, lampooning their desires as proof of corruption. Philosophers argued that monarchs should embody reason, yet courts still buzzed with gossip about mistresses. The old medieval whispers remained, adapted to new costumes. You step back, noticing how seamlessly the thread runs. From Edward II's scandalous favoritism to Louis XIV's gilded mistresses, from Alfonso XI's destructive indulgence to Henry IV's green gallant charm. The centuries shift, the fashions change, but the melody repeats. Desire corrupts, scandal multiplies, and kingship trembles. The medieval legacy of lust did not end. It evolved, adorned with pearls and powdered wigs, but still deadly. And as you leave these glittering halls, you can't help but grin. History loves to remind you, power may dress itself in gold, but underneath, the same old appetites stir, forever weaving pleasure and downfall together. You step into the final chamber, and it feels different from the others. The earlier rooms were loud with feasts, crowded with mistresses, choked with smoke and rumor. Here, however, the space feels like twilight, long shadows stretching across cold stone, a throne standing in silence. This is not about the details of one king's mistress or another's drunken banquet. This is about the larger shadow, the way desire itself, and the whispers it left behind, shaped the very idea of kingship. For in the medieval world, a king was more than a man. He was God's chosen ruler, a symbol of order in a universe believed to be fragile and easily tipped into chaos. When such a figure allowed his lusts to become public, when whispers of his desires crossed from private chambers into the streets, it did more than tarnish his reputation. It threatened the whole idea that monarchy was sacred. And you standing here realize that the perversions of kings were never just about flesh. They were about legitimacy. Consider again the story of Edward II. Whether he loved Piers Gaveston or simply relied too heavily on him almost doesn't matter. What mattered was that people believed he was ruled by passion rather than wisdom. His throne became weak because rumor painted him as weak. Nobles rebelled not only against his policies, but against the sense that his desires had corrupted the dignity of the crown. In his downfall, you see clearly how lust, real or imagined, could dismantle the scaffolding of royal authority. The same theme echoes in Philip IV's dynasty in France. The Tour de Nesle affair shattered trust in the royal household, fueling the idea that the Capetians had lost divine favor. When the dynasty stumbled into extinction a generation later, people looked back and saw proof that lust had cursed the line. The crown itself bore the stain of scandal, and its legitimacy cracked under the weight. Even rulers who seemed untouchable were shaped by this shadow. Henry VIII, larger than life, remade his entire kingdom because of his personal desires. His marriages, his lust for Anne Boleyn, his paranoia and obsession with heirs, all of it transformed England's faith, politics, and identity. You might argue Henry's indulgence didn't weaken the monarchy, but rather strengthened it through sheer force of will. Yet look closer. His dynasty ended in just 3 generations, leaving the kingdom in another succession crisis. Desire gave him power, but also hollowed out the stability beneath. Historians still argue whether lust truly toppled kingdoms or merely provided excuses for rebellion already brewing. Was Edward II overthrown because of his indulgence, or because powerful barons wanted more control? Was the Tour de Nesle affair a genuine scandal, or a convenient fiction to weaken Philip's heirs? These debates matter, but they also prove something larger. In the medieval and early modern mind, lust was always political. The belief that a king's private sins could bring down nations was enough to make it real. You pause, remembering a quirky detail. In some coronation rituals, kings were blessed with oil said to sanctify their very bodies. This meant their flesh was not their own. It belonged to God and the kingdom. So when that body was seen to indulge in vice, it wasn't just scandal, it was sacrilege. The medieval crown was not simply a hat of gold, but a halo. And desire, when too visible, cracked that halo. This is why chroniclers wrote so obsessively about lust. It wasn't only prurient curiosity, it was fear. Fear that a king's weakness would ripple outward, poisoning crops, losing battles, dooming souls. The connection between private desire and public disaster was stitched into the fabric of the age. You can see it even in sermons where preachers thundered that sinful rulers brought famine, or in chronicles that linked defeats to kings' mistresses. Whether cause or coincidence didn't matter. The people believed it, and belief shaped reality. And yet, as you wander deeper, you realize something else. Lust also humanized kings. For peasants and nobles alike, hearing that a monarch struggled with temptation made him relatable if also disappointing. A ruler who was too pure, too saintly, risked seeming distant, inhuman. Kings who indulged, whether Edward II or Alfonso XI, revealed themselves as men of flesh, however dangerously. It was a double-edged sword, humanity that undermined divinity. The paradox is almost funny if you let it be. People wanted their kings to be holy and untouchable, yet also admired them when they were virile, passionate, larger than life. A lustful king was both a threat and a spectacle. He made the court gossip-worthy, the songs bawdy, the taverns lively. Even as scandal weakened crowns, it made kings unforgettable. A pious, dutiful monarch might vanish into dusty chronicles, but the perverted ones remain vivid centuries later. Look at the legacies. Edward II, mocked and murdered, is remembered far more than Edward I's dutiful wars in Scotland. Philip IV's dynasty lives in the scandal of his daughters-in-law more than in his rigid legal reforms. Henry VII's loves and divorces overshadow his bureaucratic genius. The lustful kings, real or imagined, command memory in a way the righteous rarely do. And so you ask yourself, perhaps the shadow of desire did not merely corrupt the image of kingship. Perhaps it shaped it, gave it drama, fire, and tension. Perhaps the crown without lust would be dull, too heavy with piety, too lifeless to hold people's imaginations. Still, the consequences were real. Wars broke out, dynasties collapsed, queens died, and kingdoms fractured. Whether lust was the spark or just the excuse, it left scars on history. The medieval mind never fully separated the man from the crown, the bedchamber from the battlefield. And maybe that is why, standing here in this twilight hall, you feel the shadow so thick. Kingship itself was always balanced between glory and indulgence, holiness and temptation. One final scholarly debate lingers here. Did medieval chroniclers exaggerate lust to entertain and moralize, or were they faithfully recording a pattern that truly plagued monarchs? Historians still argue whether the most perverted kings were outliers or simply more visible examples of human failings. The answer may be lost, buried in rumor and silence. Yet the stories remain, shaping how we see monarchy even today. You let your hand brush against the cold throne. It is empty, yet it vibrates with memory. You can almost hear the whispers, laughter at banquets, cries from secret chambers, sermons condemning lust, songs mocking kings. Desire has left its mark not only on the men who wore crowns, but on the very idea of kingship. To rule was to be watched, judged, mythologized. And lust was always the most dangerous myth of all. And now, at last, you step back from the throne room, letting the doors fall shut with a quiet sigh. The long corridors of history stretch behind you, echoing with laughter from feasts, murmurs of lovers in shadow, the clash of steel, the whispered prayers of queens who hoped their kings would resist temptation. You've walked beside rulers who were hailed as divine, and yet undone by the simplest of human cravings. Desire, scandal, rumor. It shaped crowns as much as coronations, and sometimes destroyed them just as swiftly. But as you pause here at the end, the noise begins to soften. The glitter of gold fades to a dull glow, the angry voices of nobles drift into silence, and even the gossip of courtiers thins like mist in morning light. What remains is not the sharp edge of scandal, but the gentle truth beneath it. Kings were only men, clothed in finery, burdened with crowns, but men nonetheless. Their loves and their flaws remind us that history is not built by perfect figures, but by fragile, flesh and blood souls who happen to sit on thrones. You breathe slowly, as though you too have carried that heavy crown and can finally set it down. The shadows of Edward II, Henry VIII, Francis, Louis, and so many others flicker once more, then fade into the tapestry of memory. The lesson they leave is not only about corruption, but about humanity, the dangerous, beautiful, and unending pull of desire. And so, with the candles guttering low and the hall growing still, you let the story drift from your mind. The kings have had their say, the scandals have been told, and history, like you now, rests in quiet. Sleep well and dream gently.